Okay, so now that we know what GDP is, we know what we're measuring, we've talked about things that we are excluding from GDP for various reasons, and we've talked about some different ways that we measure and calculate it, and then used that number to analyze things like the business cycle and to measure growth. I want to talk real briefly about some shortcomings or some problems we run into. In other words, some things that we can't necessarily learn from looking at GDP or GDP per capita. So the first thing we have to keep in mind is that when we measure GDP, we're ending up with just one big dollar amount. And unless we, take much more detailed records when we're measuring the total expenditures, we don't necessarily know what's being produced by a country. So you may recall from our discussion of the PPF model, that demonstrates that societies face a choice with respect to what combination of consumer or capital goods they might produce using their resources. And I think I mentioned that quote from President Eisenhower. And so, we might look at a country and they may have a very large or small GDP, but then the question becomes, well, are they producing more bread and butter or more bombs and rockets or some combination of the two or completely, different goods and services? So it's a dollar amount. It tells us something, but it doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot of that detail. It doesn't give us the nitty-gritty of what we're making. The other problem that's kind of related to that is distribution. We don't necessarily know who is getting all of the goods and services that are being produced. Or more importantly, we don't necessarily know who is earning money for producing those goods and services. And so when we calculate GDP per capita, we've got to remember that it's just an average. It's giving us a number that would be the equivalent of everybody in society getting an equal slice of the pie. So in most societies, there are going to be some people that have very large slices of the pie, other people have very little to no slices of the pie, and everybody in between. So we don't necessarily know whether income is distributed, more evenly or unequally. Now another problem we run into is that sometimes the quality of the products that we're making change over time, but their market value may not. So for example, a cell phone today, a brand new iPhone, it may cost something like $600. And it turns out that maybe 30 years ago, a cell phone, when they were brand new and they were these giant things, you need to carry the battery around in a purse next to you, it may be that that same cell phone 30 years ago was also $600. So we produced a cell phone 30 years ago at $600. We produce a cell phone today at $600. In terms of GDP, in terms of the market value, it seems like nothing has changed, if we produce the same number of cell phones. But what has changed is the quality of the cell phone. A cell phone today makes much better phone calls, gets much better service, and of course it has all of the apps and gizmos and gadgets that come along with it. So product quality, if there's changes that aren't reflected in the market value, then that's going to be something that we miss out on when we're looking at GDP over time. Another thing that we may miss out on is leisure. So leisure, remember, is anything, any activity that's not work, where you're not being productive. And so this could involve, taking a swim, going to see a movie, taking a walk, reading a book. Now, in some cases, there is a market transaction that can be recorded. So when you see a movie, you pay a price to see the movie. And so we can measure the market value of all those movie tickets. And that gives us some idea of the market value of the leisure that people are taking part in. But a lot of the times, the leisure activities don't necessarily require a market transaction. In other words, you aren't paying for something. So to just walk outside and take a walk on a nice day and see a rainbow and a butterfly, you're not necessarily paying for that. But you are experiencing, a positive effect on your standard of living. You're gaining utility and happiness from taking a walk on a nice day. But because you're not paying for it, and there's no market value, then that's going to be something that doesn't get captured in GDP or GDP per capita, which remember is how we, as economists measure standard of living. And then finally, closely related to that is the environment. So there are all sorts of benefits, we get from a clean environment. There's all sorts of resources we extract from the natural environment. And, in some cases, we may be paying for those resources. And so we may be able to place a value on, a renewable forest so that we can keep producing lumber. But in some cases, we may not necessarily be able to put a market value on something from the natural environment. So, when an oil spill happens and it damages the water and it damages the beach, right, there may be a lot of money that's spent cleaning up that environmental damage, but could we place a market value on the clean beach and the clean water, right? What would people be willing to pay to protect the beach, to protect the water? Well, no one's actually doing that necessarily, and so the value that we get from a clean environment may not be reflected in a market value, and so again, that's going to be something that isn't captured in GDP, but still benefits us in some way. And so these are the shortcomings of GDP. Basically, we recognize that GDP per capita can tell us a lot of valuable information, but there are just some things that we simply cannot track with the market value.